All right, welcome in everyone. Today we are going deep on Mark 8:34. You know that verse that probably every single one of you listening knows by heart. But today, well, we are going to try to dig into some of the stuff that maybe you haven't thought of before.
Yeah, we've got some really interesting sources, commentaries, sermons, even some stuff that you wouldn't think would be related. We're going to pull it all together and see what we can find.
Exactly. We're looking at what pastors at, Peak City Church, First Baptist Arlington, even University Church of Christ, just to name a few, all have to say about this well-known passage. So let's jump right in. Let's start with a question that I think a lot of people get stuck on. And that's like, what did take up your cross even mean back then?
Okay, so both radical commitment, that's the one from Peak City Church, by the way, and following Christ, beyond fans to true discipleship from Waymark Church, they really hit on this idea of historical context. Like, for the folks hearing Jesus say this, taking up your cross wasn't just some nice metaphor. It was like this brutal, in-your-face image of public humiliation and a really horrible death. Yeah?
Yeah, it's hard for us to even imagine that kind of weight. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
how do we even begin to, I don't know, get that across to people today?
Peak City Church had this, I thought, really clever analogy. They said to think about signing for a car loan.
Mm.
You wouldn't buy a car without knowing what the payments were going to be, right? Like the insurance and, all the stuff that comes with
That's such a good point. Yeah, it's like you really got to understand like all the requirements before you sign on the dotted line.
Yeah, and in this case, it's not just a car. It's about understanding like the lifelong commitment that comes with following Jesus.
There's like counting the cost.
Yeah.
Not just in our heads, but like really understanding what that means in real practical terms.
Mm.
Now, another thing that kept popping up in a lot of these sermons, we saw it in First Baptist Arlington, CIA Church, Bettendorf Presbyterian, and University Church of Christ too, and that is this idea of self-denial. But I'm curious, like, what are some of the less obvious interpretations of that? What did you see that stood out?
So First Baptist Arlington, they use this really interesting analogy of a gardener pruning plants. It's not just about chopping stuff off randomly. It's about like carefully cutting things back so that the plant can grow even better.
I like that. So it's not about just like depriving yourself for no reason.
Yeah.
It's more about strategically removing, I guess you could say, obstacles.
Right. Obstacles that are getting in the way of, your spiritual growth. And then Bettendorf Presbyterian, they contrasted discipleship with this idea of cultural appropriation.
Ooh, that's interesting.
Yeah, they were basically saying that it's not about just, looking like a disciple on the outside. It's about this genuine, like, internal transformation.
So it's deeper than just checking boxes. It's like really embodying those values. That's powerful connection. And speaking of embodying, I got to say, these pastors, they got really creative with their illustrations. Like CIAG Church, they use this analogy of a potter shaping clay.
Oh, yeah, that one really sticks with you. It really gets at this idea that we're always being molded either by Christ or by the world around us.
Right, it's like a constant process.
Yeah.
And then you have Waymark Church, and they keep it super simple,
Yeah.
but it's so effective. They're like, just because you wear a baseball cap doesn't make you an athlete. Right, like outward appearances, they don't equal commitment.
It kind of makes you wonder, what are some other everyday examples like that? Like things that we could use to drive that point home?
I like that. It's a challenge. And then for a totally different approach, River City Community Church, they use the analogy of fast food versus, healthy eating.
Yeah, the easy way versus the hard but good way.
Right, because we all know fast food might taste good in the moment, but, ultimately it doesn't do much for you.
Exactly. These sermons are really reminding us that discipleship, it takes that, that discipline, that intentionality.
It's like choosing those healthy options consistently. And it's interesting how a lot of these sermons, they tie Mark 8:34 to like other parts of the Bible.
Yeah, those cross references, they add so much, don't they? Like First Baptist Arlington, they bring in Hebrews 13:5 to 6. That really powerful reminder that even when things get tough, God's always with us.
And Waymark Church, they use Numbers 9.1523, the Israelites following the cloud, to show how, following God is not a one-time decision. It's this constant, like, journey.
Which brings us to Peak City Church, and they quote missionary Jim Elliot, "He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose."
I mean, come on, that really gets to the core of what we're talking about here, doesn't it? Like, self-denial following Christ, it makes you rethink what it means to gain and lose.
It really does. It's like real fulfillment comes when we, surrender to something bigger than ourselves.
So before we move on, I want everyone to take a second and just think about all this. The history, the illustrations, what really resonates with you?
It's funny, we always focus on taking up the cross, but self-denial, that feels like that's the real key here.
I mean, they go together, don't they? Like, you can't really have one without the other.
Exactly. And going back to what Peak City Church was saying about that historical context, like back then, taking up your cross was literally like the ultimate act of self-denial. It meant literally giving up everything, even your life.
Yeah, and that's a tough pill to swallow. It's like discipleship, it demands that we totally change what matters most to us.
And that often means letting go of things we really, really like, things that we think are good, even.
What kind of things are we talking about here? What would that look like?
Okay, so remember First Baptist Arlington and the whole like gardening analogy.
Mhm.
Sometimes we got to prune away those habits, those relationships, even ambitions, things that are holding us back spiritually.
Even if they aren't bad in themselves.
Right.
Mm.
Yeah, exactly. It's about understanding that anything that becomes more important than our relationship with Christ, that's a problem.
And that's where Peak City Church's idea of using CarGurus, like that app, comes in. We're so bad at judging what's actually valuable. We go after all this temporary stuff, all these worldly goals.
But Mark 8:34 is like, hold on a second, let's reevaluate that. Let's look at things from God's point of view.
Yeah, it's like we're constantly bombarded with these messages telling us what we should want, what we should be chasing after. But it's all like so fleeting.
And when we can finally let go of our own little plans, our own little ambitions, and just surrender to God, that's when we find real purpose. That's when it gets exciting.
It's amazing to me how all these pastors, they use such different illustrations to get these really deep points across. We've got car loans and gardening and even fast food.
Yeah, there's so much richness there, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes it so engaging. It's not just the same old stuff rehashed. It's fresh, it's relatable.
Let's talk about those cross-references that some of the sermons use. That was something that really stood out to me. Like First Baptist Arlington, they connected Mark 8:34 to Hebrews 13.56, that promise that God will never leave us.
Yeah, it's like no matter how hard it gets, no matter what you have to go through, you're not alone.
And Waymark Church, they bring in numbers 9.1523, where the Israelites are following the cloud. It shows how following God, it's not just like a one and done deal. It's a continual, like every single day, you're following him.
It's both exciting and, I don't know, kind of scary at the same time, right? Because you're always having to be open to God's leading.
Even when you have no idea where it's going to take you.
Exactly. Another thing that really stuck with me, and we mentioned it before, but it's worth repeating, is that quote that Peak City Church used. That one from Jim Elliot. He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose.
It's so simple, but it's so deep.
Yeah.
It's like it makes you completely rethink how you define gain and loss.
It's a total game changer. And it's not about making people feel guilty about following Jesus. It's about helping them see the true value. Like, this is the real deal.
It's a real alternative to what the world offers. Okay, so we've talked a lot about these different interpretations, all these amazing illustrations. But how do we actually make this practical? Like, for the folks listening, for pastors, for Bible study leaders, what can they take away from all of this?
Well, one thing that I think is really crucial is figuring out how to explain Mark 8:34 in a way that makes sense today. Like, we have to bridge that gap between the historical stuff and what people are going through right now.
So how do we do that? Like, what are some actual tips?
Well, one way is to do what these pastors are doing. Use illustrations, analogies, stuff that people can connect with. Talk about everyday life, current events, even pop culture. Make it relatable.
Yeah, find those things that will click with people, that will help them see the deeper truth in this passage.
Another big thing is to emphasize how powerful discipleship is. It's not just about following rules. It's about letting Christ transform you from the inside out.
And that transformation, it's a process, right? It's not like you flip a switch and boom, you're done.
Exactly. It's a journey. And as pastors and Bible study leaders, it's our job to help guide people on that journey, to encourage them to embrace self-denial, to seek God's will, and to find joy in surrendering to his plan.
It's about helping them see that taking up their cross, following Christ, it's not a punishment. It's an invitation to a much fuller, richer life.
And that's a message that people need to hear. One of the things that really stood out to me as we were going through these sermons was how much emphasis they put on the challenges that come with talking about this passage. Like, how do you preach on something that people have heard a million times and make it feel fresh?
That's a great point. Because it's so easy for it to just become like background noise.
Right. So how do you make it like hit home?
Yeah, like how do you breathe new life into it?
Well, one way, like we've been talking about, is to go back to the historical context. Really paint that picture of what it meant to take up your cross back in Roman times. I mean, that's a heavy image.
And when people grasp that, then the sacrifice that Jesus is calling for, the commitment, it takes on a whole new meaning.
Another thing that can really help is focusing on what self-denial actually means for us, like today,
Hmm.
not in theory, but, what are some practical ways that people can deny themselves? What are those areas where they might have to surrender to God?
Yeah, give me an example. Like, what would that look like?
Okay, so we could talk about how important it is to put our relationship with God above our jobs, our hobbies, even how much time we spend on social media.
Or even just like serving others, even when it's not convenient or when it pushes us outside our comfort zone.
Yeah, exactly. When we can make it real, make it about everyday life, that's when people start to see how Mark 8:34 applies to them, and that's what leads to real change?
And that's what it's all about. Another thing that really impressed me was how creative these pastors got with their illustrations.
Oh yeah, they really went all out. Like you've got car loans, gardening, even like cultural appropriation and fast food.
I know, right? It's amazing how they use all these different, sometimes totally unexpected examples to really make this passage come to life.
It reminds us that, we don't have to stick to just the usual biblical stuff. We can draw from anything that helps us get the message across.
And that's so important, especially with a verse like Mark 8:34, because for some people, it can be a little bit abstract,
Mhm.
even a little intimidating.
So how do we help pastors and Bible study leaders? How do we encourage them to get more creative with their illustration?
Yeah, like what are some things they can do?
Well, first of all, they got to be paying attention, like really paying attention to what's going on around them, what people are interested in.
Look for those everyday moments, those things that everyone's talking about, and use that as a starting point.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to experiment. Like try out different analogies, different metaphors and see what works.
It's about finding those things that will like click with people,
Hmm.
those things that will make them go, oh, I get it.
Another key takeaway from these sermons is that we need to show how Mark 8:34 fits into the bigger picture of the Bible. It's not just some random verse floating out there.
It's part of a much bigger story.
And when we can connect it to other passages, to other themes, that's when it starts to really make sense.
For instance, we could talk about how it relates to grace. Like, discipleship might be hard, but it's all because of God's love for us, his unconditional love.
Or we could connect it to, the idea of mission. Taking up your cross, it's not just about being good for yourself, it's about joining God in what he's doing in the world.
Yeah, when we can show how it all fits together, it just adds so much more depth and meaning, doesn't it?
It does, and it can inspire people to really embrace the challenge of discipleship. Okay, so as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a challenge. How are you going to apply all this to your ministry?
Yeah, if you're a pastor, how are you going to preach on Mark 8:34 in a way that's both, fresh and true to the text?
And if you're leading a Bible study,
Mhm.
how can you create discussions that really get people thinking about what this verse means for their lives?
And I think the most important question is, how can you live out this message of self-denial and cross-bearing? Because ultimately, people are going to learn more from what they see than from what they hear.
It's about walking the walk, not just talking the talk. These are big questions, and they deserve some real thought and prayer.
Absolutely. And as you seek God's guidance, he will give you everything you need to share the truth of Mark 8:34 with clarity, conviction, and compassion.
It's about letting the words of Christ truly transform our hearts and our minds.
We've really dug deep into Mark 8:34. We've talked about the history, the illustrations, all those practical tips for pastors and Bible study leaders.
And before we wrap up, I want to go back to that Jim Elliot quote, the one that Peak City Church used. He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose.
It's so powerful, isn't it? Like it really gets to the heart of what it means to follow Christ.
Yeah.
To really deny yourself. And it challenges us to rethink what we consider valuable.
It does. It's like, what are we really holding on to? What do we think is so precious? Remember that CarGurus analogy? Like using that app to figure out what a car is actually worth?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
What if we did that with discipleship? Like, what if we use CarGurus to assess the true cost and value of following Jesus?
That's a really interesting thought. Like, what would we discover?
I think we'd be surprised. We might find out that the things we're clinging to so tightly, the things we think are so important, well, they're actually losing value all the time.
While the things that feel like sacrifices, putting God first, serving others, those are the things that actually have like eternal value.
Exactly. It's a whole different way of looking at things. And it's not about, guilt-tripping people into following Jesus. It's about showing them what they're really getting. It's about, like, the best deal ever.
It's a real alternative. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Mark 8:3-4, I want to leave you with this. If we were to actually use CarGurus, to evaluate discipleship, what would that tell us about how we understand the cost and the value of following Jesus?
It's a question that we all need to wrestle with, like, personally and as we lead others. And as we do, I really believe that the Holy Spirit will help us understand more deeply what it means to deny ourselves, to take up our cross, and to follow Christ.
Thank you all so much for joining us on this deep dive into Mark 8:3-4. I hope this is giving you some new ideas, maybe challenge you to think about this verse in a new way.
Remember, it's not about, becoming an expert in theology. It's about letting the words of Jesus change us, change our hearts and minds, and lead us to a life of true discipleship.
And as you go, may you have the courage and the grace to embrace the cost of following Jesus, knowing that the reward is beyond measure.